of the things standing between two families wasn't a canyon, but a memory no one wanted to face. For 50 years, two ranches sat side by side on the same stretch of dusty earth, and for 50 years, not a single word crossed that invisible line. No handshakes, no hellos, just silence carried down like inheritance. But then one man did something unthinkable that no one had ever expected. This is a story about a fence that didn't divide but healed. Before we begin this heartwarming tale, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stick around, because in the forgotten frontier, the simplest act can break a lifetime of bitterness. There wasn't a soul in Laramie Ridge who didn't know about the Daniels-Callahan feud. It wasn't the kind of fight folks talked about over drinks. It was older than most of them. Born from blood and pride, and a dispute that nobody could quite agree on anymore. Some said it started over stolen cattle. Others swore it was a poker game gone wrong. A few claimed it came down to a woman neither side would name, though the details always got fuzzy right around that part. What mattered more was the result. 50 years of silence. Two ranches, side by side, hundreds of acres brushing up against each other, and not a single interaction. No trade, no greetings. Not even a nod at the general store. The Daniels Ranch sat to the west, where the sun hit first thing in the morning. Long stretches of pasture land, weather-beaten barns, and a house that had been repaired more times than anyone could count. That land belonged to Henry Daniels now, mid-50s, lean as a fence rail, with eyes that didn't blink much and a voice like sandpaper. To the east sat the Callahan spread. A little more modern, a touch better funded, with new fencing and solar panels popping up like stubborn weeds. It was run by Clayton Callahan, a man who wore pressed shirts even in hay season and looked like he gave firm handshakes with a little too much pressure. The land between them, a crooked stretch of dry creek bed and overgrown grass, was known locally as no man's land. Neither ranch claimed it. Neither one fenced it. They just let it sit there, like a scar they refused to touch. And that's where Jesse Daniels came in. Jesse had never been one to follow the old grudges. He was Henry's youngest, the last of 3 boys, and the only one who hadn't moved off to find quieter work in a city where cows didn't outweigh people. Jesse stayed. Not out of obligation, but because the land felt honest. Even in its silence, it had stories to tell. You just had to know how to listen. But Jesse also saw the nonsense in the feud. He'd grown up hearing half versions of the tale, his father's voice growing stiff whenever the Callahans were mentioned. As a kid, Jesse had once wandered too close to the property line, and Henry had snapped, "You stay on our side." Nothing good ever came from that direction. Jesse had obeyed then. But years later, with sweat on his brow and his boots planted firmly in dry soil, he started to question all that inherited bitterness. Especially after his father's heart attack. It hadn't been fatal, but it shook something loose. Henry recovered. Slower than he wanted to admit, and Jesse had picked up the slack. He ran the daily ops, handled the supplies, rotated the herds. And the more responsibility he carried, the more he saw how wasteful the silence was, especially when he noticed a Callahan girl about his age, dark braid down her back, sharp eyes that watched more than they spoke, leave a canteen on their side of the property line one scorching day in June. She didn't take anything, didn't cross more than a step or two, just set it down near a patch of shade where one of their calves had wandered, alone and panting. Jesse didn't tell his father, but he remembered that moment. It stuck. By late summer, fencing became a problem. One of the older wire lines had collapsed during a storm, leaving a whole stretch of land vulnerable to stray movement. Jesse had tried to reinforce it from the day west, but the boundary was crooked, too close to the dry creek bed to anchor anything long-term. And putting up temporary posts only made things worse. He stood there one afternoon, hand on his hip, sweat soaking the brim of his hat, and stared across the land that didn't belong to anyone. Or maybe, he thought, it belonged to both of them. and neither had the guts to admit it. That night, while Henry dozed in his recliner, TV flickering in the corner of the room, Jesse spread out an old topographic map on the kitchen table. He traced the natural curve of the land, then marked a find and then marked a northern potential line. Not the boundary line from the county records, but a functional one. One that would let both ranches graze smarter, split the access to the creek during wet season, and reduce the brush fire risk that always crept up mid-August, and it would run straight through no man's land. He didn't tell anyone at first. He just got to work. The first post went in 3 days later. He used a manual driver, heavy, awkward, and honest. The kind of tool that left blisters but didn't lie about the effort. Boone, the ranch dog, watched from a shady patch under the flatbed, panting hard with his tongue hanging like a tired flag. Post after post, Jesse moved through the overgrowth. Not fast, not careless, just deliberate. Some days he felt eyes on him. From the east side, that quiet Callahan stretch where no one came too close, but no one stopped him either. No words. No warnings. Just silence and space. One evening, while packing up his gear near the halfway point, he heard the unmistakable crunch of boots on dry grass. He turned slowly, not startled, just alert. It was her. The girl from before. She stood about 10 feet away, arms crossed over her chest, a worn cap pulled low over her brow. "You lost?" she asked. Jesse shook his head. "No, ma'am. Just fixing what needed fixing." She looked past him, at the half-built fence line snaking across the earth. "That your idea of fixing?" "It's not about sides," he said calmly. "It's about sense. This land's been ignored so long it's about to turn to brush fire kindling." Figured this was a smarter line. She tilted her head. "You know who I am?" "Not exactly," Jesse replied. "But I'm guessing Callahan's not just a rumor anymore." She smirked, just a little. Leah Callahan. Jesse Daniels. A pause. Long enough to matter. Then she said, "Well, Jesse Daniels, if you're going to build a fence through no man's land, you better make sure it holds." "I plan to," he said. "But I ain't doing it alone. Not if we both got cattle that graze here." Leah studied him. Long and quiet. Then she nodded once. Not a promise, not a handshake, but enough. And that's how it began. Jesse didn't expect much after that brief conversation with Leah. Honestly, he figured she'd vanish back into the east pasture and tell her family. He was out there swinging a post driver in neutral territory. Maybe they'd laugh. Maybe they'd curse. Either way, he was ready to finish the fence on his own. But the next morning, when he pulled up to the line, he noticed something had changed. A dozen fresh cedar posts lay neatly stacked beside the stretch he'd been working on. Not his pile. And they weren't there the day before. He squinted toward the Callahan side, but the fields were empty. Jesse didn't smile. Not exactly. But there was a shift in his chest. Something warm and wordless. He wiped the sweat from his brow, grabbed the driver, and got to work. Day after day, the fence took shape. And now he wasn't alone. He never saw Leah working directly alongside him, but her presence was undeniable. The supplies showed up where he needed them. Clean coils of barbed wire, sealed buckets of post cement, fresh gloves when his got worn through. Quiet help. Invisible, but steady. It wasn't until the second week that they crossed paths again. She showed up mid-morning with a cooler slung over one shoulder and a jug of iced tea under the other. "Figured you'd earned a break," she said, setting it down without fanfare. Jesse looked up from the corner post he'd just sunk. "Much obliged." They sat side by side in the shade of the flatbed, sipping tea and watching the fence stretch out like a spine stitching the land together. For a while, neither spoke. Then Leah asked, "Your dad know you're doing this?" Jesse took a long sip before answering. "Not in so many words." "Thought so. Mine doesn't either." There it was, the unspoken weight between them, finally named. Two legacies forged in stubborn silence, now quietly threatened by a fence neither patriarch would approve of. "You think they'd stop us?" Jesse asked. Leah considered that. Not outright. But there'd be shouting, cold dinners, maybe some thrown tools. He chuckled, just a bit. Sounds about right. And that was it, the beginning of a rhythm. They didn't talk every day. But when they did, it was easy. No small talk, no nervous energy. Just a shared task with long pauses in between, and maybe that's why it worked. They weren't trying to fix the past. They were building something new, post by post, inch by inch. But peace, even the quiet kind, doesn't come without friction. One evening, after a long day of fencing and sun, Jesse came home to find Henry standing by the barn, arms crossed, a deep line carved into his forehead. "What the hell are you building out there?" the old man asked. No greeting, no warmth. Jesse didn't flinch. He unlatched the tailgate and started unloading the tools. "A fence? You building it on their land?" "No, on no man's land." Henry scoffed. "Ain't no such thing. That land don't belong to anyone for a reason. We don't touch it. They don't touch it." "Yeah," Jesse said quietly. "And look where that's got us." Henry stepped forward. "You think a few feet of wire's gonna fix 5 decades of bad blood?" Jesse looked his father in the eye, calm and steady. "I'm not trying to fix the past. I'm trying to stop dragging it forward." For a moment, Henry's jaw twitched, but he didn't respond. He just turned and walked into the barn, the door swinging shut behind him a little harder than necessary. The next few days were heavy. Not because of anything Leah said, she didn't press, but because Jesse could feel the weight of generations bearing down on every choice he made. Fencing wasn't just fencing anymore. It was a quiet act of rebellion, of responsibility, of choosing a better story than the one he was handed. Leah brought up the history once, as they were tying down a corner loop near the old creek bed. "You ever hear how it actually started?" she asked, hands gripping the wire tightly. Jesse shook his head. "Just the noise, lots of yelling, never anything clear. My granddad said it was a business deal gone bad. Something about a water contract and a handshake that never turned into paper. Your side thought we broke a promise. Ours thought. Yours were trying to rewrite it." He considered that. "Sounds about right." She paused, then added, "Funny thing is, my dad didn't even know the full details. He just carried it forward like gospel." Jesse pulled the wire taut, let the tension hum. "Yeah, like we were all born holding someone else's grudge." Leah looked up at him. "I don't want to keep doing that." He met her eyes. "Me neither." By the 3rd week, the fence was nearly finished. What started as an act of practicality had turned into something else entirely, a bridge, even if made from wire and wood. Locals started to notice. Word spread in quiet ways. A cousin mentioned it to a neighbor, who brought it up to the guy at the feed store, and before long, old-timers started driving past just to get a look. They didn't stop, didn't say anything. But their presence was enough. And then, without warning, it all hit the wall. Henry showed up. Jesse was kneeling near the last post when the truck rolled up in a cloud of gravel. The engine shut off hard, and when Henry stepped out, he looked like a man who hadn't slept in 2 days. "What is this?" he barked. Leah was already there, standing on the opposite side of the post line, shoulders squared. Jesse stood slowly. "A fence," he said again. "One that makes sense for the land." Henry's eyes flicked to Leah, then back to Jesse. "With her?" "With both of us," Jesse replied. "It's not a truce. It's not politics. It's just necessary." Henry's hands curled slightly at his sides. "You think you're the first one to try sense around here? This land's soaked in pride and mistakes. You build a fence, and you might as well build a tombstone for the old ways." Jesse nodded, thoughtful. "Maybe that's what it needs. A marker to say we're done carrying ghosts." There was a long silence. Wind swept across the tall grass, and somewhere in the distance, a lone crow cried out. Henry didn't respond. He looked at the post, then the wire, then his son, and he walked away, not with rage, not with defeat, but with a weight that suggested he might be thinking, really thinking, for the first time in years. The fence line was finished 3 days later. It wasn't perfect. It leaned in places, and one post was sunk a little off-center. But it held. Strong, straight, and clean. And right in the middle, where the creek bed curved, they added something extra. A wooden sign, hand-carved by Leah and stained by Jesse. It read, "Shared ground. No more silence." Not bold, not loud, but clear. The morning after they hung the sign, Jesse woke early. He poured coffee, black and simple, then walked out to the porch and sat on the top step, cradling the mug like it held something more than caffeine. From that spot, if the sun was just right, he could see the faint shimmer of the new fence cutting through the land like a gentle crease, not a wall, not a divider, just a line with a message. Shared ground. No more silence. He'd said the words out loud the night before, after Leah finished screwing in the bolts and stood back with a dirt-smudged smile. She'd nodded, not needing to say anything more. They were both tired, dust-covered, and sun-worn, but in a good way. The kind of tired that meant something. Jesse had dropped her back at her side of the property as the sky turned pink with evening, and she'd disappeared into the Callahan house without a glance back. That morning, Boone, Jesse's old blue heeler, came to sit beside him with a yawn, tail thudding softly against the porch planks. The dog's easy company reminded Jesse that life, despite all its barbed edges, had a strange way of offering calm in the in-between moments. But calm didn't mean silence. Not anymore. By midday, word had started to spread wider. At the co-op store, where folks came in for feed and gossip, someone asked if it was true. Daniels and Callahan's working the same stretch of land, building together? The manager, who'd seen the receipts from both sides, gave a half shrug and said, "Stranger things have happened." But you could see the spark catch in the room. Nobody had seen this coming. The county sheriff stopped by later that week, not with a badge ready to mediate, but out of plain curiosity. He parked his cruiser by the west road and walked out to the fence line where Jesse happened to be checking the wire tension near a gate they'd added for joint access. Hell of a project, the sheriff said, nodding toward the work. Jesse wiped his hands on his jeans and nodded back. "Yeah, it's been a while in the making." The sheriff squinted toward the signpost, then looked back at Jesse with a dry smile. "You realize what you've done, don't you? I built a fence." "No," the sheriff said, hooking his thumbs into his belt. "You buried a grudge. Or at least gave folks a place to put it down for a while." Jesse didn't know how to answer that. It felt too big, too final. He just said, "Felt like the right time." The sheriff tipped his hat and said, "Well, I'd reckon you just made history without firing a shot. That's something." After he left, Jesse sat on the tailgate and stared at the gate he and Leah had installed together. A welded arch with a wooden latch and double chains, simple, strong, and easy to open. Funny how so much of life came down to that. Whether you chose to build gates or fences, you couldn't get through. The change didn't come all at once. Most people in Laramie Ridge were slower to trust than they were to change their tires. But fences, they understood those. Fences you could see, measure, test. And so, one by one, neighbors began to drive out just to see what had been done. Some came in quiet vehicles, their windows cracked just enough to catch a glimpse. Others parked outright, wandered a few feet into the grass, and stood with arms crossed and heads tilted. They didn't always speak, but more than a few took out their phones and snapped a photo of the sign. By the end of the second week, Jesse started noticing more than just footprints. A couple from down the valley brought out old planks of unused cedar, leaving them neatly piled near the fence line. Someone else left a jug of oil and a pack of replacement hinges. Leah texted him one evening, just a single line, "We might have started something." He read it twice and smiled. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. At the next monthly town board meeting, tucked into the back room of the church hall, the tension finally made its way out into words. Henry showed up, which in itself was rare. He wore his usual work shirt and jeans, but his eyes had that flint-hard edge that Jesse knew meant trouble. When Jesse stepped inside and saw his father sitting front row, hands folded, he knew something was coming. The meeting rolled through its regular business, county roads, budget talk, wildfire prep, before the floor was open for comment. That's when Henry stood up. "I've got something to say about boundaries," he began. His voice was calm, but it carried. The room went still. Jesse sat up straighter, but didn't speak. He wanted to hear what his father really thought. Not from the porch, not muttered under breath, but out loud, where it mattered. "For 50 years, Henry continued, folks around here respected a line that didn't need ink. It was understood. Callahans kept to theirs, we kept to ours. No fights, no mess, just space, a few nods, a few stares. But now," Henry said, glancing toward his son, "some folks want to redraw that line. Say it's progress. Say it's healing." He let that sit for a moment. Then something shifted. "I don't know if it is," he said finally. "But I know my son's got more patience and sense in his bones than most men I've met. And if he says it's time to let old ghosts lie down, maybe we ought to let him rest." The silence that followed was thick. Not with tension, but surprise. Jesse didn't move. His chest tightened, and not from nerves. That was the closest thing to approval his father had ever spoken in public. It didn't fix everything, but it did something. When the meeting adjourned, Henry didn't wait. He walked out with his hat pulled low, boots heavy on the floor. But as Jesse followed him outside, the old man paused just long enough to say, "You did it right. Just didn't need to do it alone." And with that, he climbed into his truck and drove off. The next morning, Jesse found Leah already at the fence line, tightening a sagging wire. She looked up, smirked, and asked, "So, you're local famous now?" "Something like that," he replied, dropping his gear beside hers. They worked in companionable silence for a while, until she broke it again. "My dad didn't say much," she said, voice even. "But he came out to the fence yesterday. Just stared at it for a long time. I asked him if he wanted to paint over the sign. He just shook his head." Jesse looked up. "That's something." "Yeah, maybe it's enough." He nodded, then reached for the next coil of wire. "Let's make sure it holds." And side by side, they kept building. It didn't make the papers. Not officially. There was no headline, no photo spread, no televised moment. But everyone in Laramie Ridge knew that a shift had taken place. Quiet as it was, it had weight. And over time, that new fence, the one that cut straight across no man's land, started to take on meaning that no one expected when the first post was driven into the ground. By the end of that summer, more had changed than just the view between the Daniels and Callahan spreads. A sense of movement had returned to the valley. Something had loosened in the ground. Fences were being repaired. Fields that hadn't been jointly grazed in years were suddenly being walked by ranchers from both sides of the line, not with suspicion, but with questions that sounded a lot like opportunity. Jesse noticed it most in the way conversations shifted. Where folks used to speak in circles, cautiously skirting anything that involved the old feud, now they asked things like, "How do you convince Leah to work with you?" Or, "Think this'll hold through winter?" Questions with forward motion, ones that assumed continuation, not collapse. Even Henry, gruff as ever, started showing up at the fence line now and again, saying things like, "Post number 32's leaning a bit," or, "You sure this hinge will hold with a cattle press?" Not criticisms, just involvement, however reluctant. And Jesse didn't press him. He let his father come to terms with it in his own time, in his own way. That was the thing about change. It stuck better when it wasn't forced. Leah, for her part, had become a fixture in Jessie's routine, even if she wouldn't admit it out loud. They still worked the fence together, not because it needed constant maintenance, but because it gave them space. Some days they'd walk the line and say almost nothing. Other days, they'd lose whole hours trading stories they hadn't told anyone else about growing up in homes thick with silence, about watching two proud men carry grudges they barely understood, about always feeling like the peacemakers, but never being handed the tools to actually make peace. It was Leah who first brought up the idea of the harvest gathering. They were sitting on the back of Jessie's truck near dusk, watching the horizon flicker with the first hints of fall. "We used to do a harvest supper," she said, her voice low but certain, "way back, before the feud. Families from both sides, long tables, fire pits, even dancing, I think." Jessie looked at her, brows raised. "Hard to picture." She smiled. "I found a photo, in a box in our attic. My mom had kept it. She wasn't a Callahan by birth, you know. Married in. Said the last one they had was the year before the trouble started." Jessie sipped his coffee. "Let that sink in. You thinking of bringing it back?" "I'm thinking it's already halfway here," she said, nodding toward the sign they'd made together. "Might as well set the table." They didn't plan it like an event. There were no invitations, no flyers. Just word of mouth and a big open pasture that hadn't hosted anything more exciting than a fence post in 50 years. Jessie cleaned off an old flatbed to use as a stage. Leah wrangled her cousins to string up lights. Henry, without comment, contributed 4 tables and 3 water barrels from the barn. He didn't say why. He just dropped them off with a posa grunt and left before anyone could thank him. And on the last Saturday before the first frost, folks came. They came with crockpots and paper plates, with folding chairs and coolers full of lemonade. They came from both sides, not in waves, but in pairs and clusters, like they were testing the ground before trusting it. Jessie watched from the far edge of the field, near the signpost, as neighbors who hadn't shared eye contact in years nodded across the food table and asked things like, "Mind if I try your cornbread?" Or, "You still keeping those Angus cows?" Leah stood beside him, arms crossed, her face unreadable for a moment. "You good?" Jessie asked. She nodded, slowly. "I wasn't sure it'd actually happen. Thought maybe folks still be too stuck. Some of 'em probably are," he said. "But most just needed permission." As the sky deepened into purple and the field filled with the soft murmur of conversation and laughter, something unexpected happened. A fiddle started up. No microphone. No big announcement. Just a slow, familiar waltz from the corner of the flatbed where a grizzled man named Roy, known mostly for repairing fence posts and quoting scripture, sat down with his instrument and started to play like no one was watching. People didn't dance right away. It took a few minutes, but eventually a couple stepped out. Then another. And suddenly, there it was, something no one had seen in half a century. Motion, joy, ease. Jessie didn't dance, not at first. But when Leah tugged on his sleeve with that look that meant she wasn't asking, he followed her into the open space like it was the most natural thing in the world. They didn't talk as they moved, didn't need to. The rhythm was enough. Later that night, as the last trucks pulled away and the field quieted down, Jessie and Leah sat once more at the fence line. The lights still glowed above them, faint now, and the stars had come out in full. Leah leaned back, arms behind her, eyes on the sky. "You think it'll stick?" she asked. "The fence?" "No," she said softly. "The change." Jessie thought for a long while before answering. "I think things only change when someone decides to stop waiting for the other side to move first," he said. "And we did that. That matters." She nodded, the faintest smile on her lips. Boone barked from the truck bed, chasing shadows, and they both laughed. It was a small sound, but it carried far. In the weeks that followed, Jesse noticed something strange, a sense of lightness, not just in the air but in people. Conversations lasted a little longer at the feed store. Eye contact was held instead of dodged. Fewer hands were shoved into pockets during greetings. The fence didn't just mark a boundary anymore. It marked a choice to connect, to build, to stop repeating a story that had long since lost its shape. It never made the front page, but maybe that's what made it real. Quiet change doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be lived. And as far as fences go, this one didn't just hold livestock. It held history, respect, and something neither side had expected to find again: peace.